If you're going to insult someone in German, at least get the grammar right. That one sentence stopped everything. The dining room, polished, hushed, dripping with old money, froze like a scene in a movie. Silverware hovered midair. Conversations died on lips. And all eyes turned to the man at table 7, the man no one had expected to speak like that, let alone in perfect, educated German. Emma Clark, the server, had thought she was safe. Safe behind a foreign tongue, safe in her quiet judgment, safe in her assumptions. She'd whispered something smug in German to a coworker. A jab about the man's outfit, his presence, the way he didn't fit this world of white linen and silent power. A man like him, a young, black CEO, surely hadn't earned his place at that table. Surely he must have stumbled into success, backed by luck or worse, someone else's favor. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know he had studied at the best institutions in Europe, that he'd lived in Berlin for years, had read Goethe in the original German, and spoken at conferences where her favorite professors were only guests. She didn't know that behind the calm smile was a man who had been underestimated his entire life, who knew exactly what it felt like to be misjudged at first glance, and what it took to hold his tongue, until it mattered most. And tonight, it mattered. What happened next wasn't just a linguistic mic drop. It was a dismantling, an unmasking. The moment when power didn't speak loudly, it spoke fluently, precisely, with a kind of grace that stings more than rage ever could. This is not just a story of words. It's a story about perception, pride, and the quiet strength of choosing the perfect moment to remind the world exactly who you are. And if stories like this hit something deep inside you, a little truth, a little fire, stay with us. You're about to witness what happens when power speaks softly, but strikes deep. Malik Carter never wanted to be the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. The way he carried himself, calm, grounded, sharp-eyed, said everything before he ever opened his mouth. At 37, Malik was the CEO of Nimble Labs, a rising star in the world of medical technology. His company wasn't just pushing boundaries. It was saving lives. Quietly. Efficiently. With intention. Born and raised in Atlanta, Malik was the son of a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse's aide. He grew up watching her come home late, exhausted, but never defeated. It was her stories, of broken equipment in underfunded clinics, of patients who deserved better, that planted the seed. Long before he understood business or biotech, Malik understood this. Access to healthcare should not depend on your zip code. That seed grew. Through scholarships and sheer willpower, he made his way to Howard University, where he studied biomedical engineering. Then came a Fulbright to Germany, where he completed his doctorate in public health and systems design. While other young professionals chased status, Malik chased solutions. He wanted to build something that mattered. Something that lasted. And he did. Nimble Labs specialized in compact, affordable diagnostic tools, products that could work in rural communities, overcrowded clinics, or disaster zones. Under Malik's leadership, the company partnered with local hospitals and non-profit networks across the US and abroad. The press didn't always notice. That was fine by him. He wasn't in it for headlines. He believed in impact, not ego. But make no mistake, Malik knew the game. He understood how the boardroom worked, how assumptions about race and background could turn allies into skeptics. That's why he mastered every room he entered. Not by shouting. Not by demanding attention, but by knowing more than anyone expected, and never showing all his cards at once. He dressed sharp but understated. No flashy watches, no entourage, just precision, presence, and purpose. Some called him aloof. Others called him arrogant. They were wrong. He was observant, strategic, calculated in the best way. So when he stepped into Ethelgard's that night, a polished, high-ceilinged restaurant known for discretion and excess, he didn't come to impress anyone. He came to decompress. Celebrate a new contract. Enjoy a meal without performance. He did not expect to be tested. Not like that. Not by someone who thought she had him all figured out. But Malik Carter had spent his whole life preparing for that moment. And he was about to remind everyone in the room that perception is often the first lie we tell ourselves. Emma Clark did not grow up dreaming of serving cocktails to people who didn't see her. There was a time, not long ago, when her world looked very different. She had plans, purpose, promise. Born in Portland, Oregon, Emma was the daughter of two public school teachers who believed in books, boundaries, and the power of asking the right questions. Her mother, Margaret, was a language scholar who spoke 4 languages fluently, including German. By the time Emma was 12, she could hold her own in German conversation, watching classic films and reading Goethe aloud just to make her mother proud. She was sharp, quick to challenge, always 2 steps ahead in debate club. Her path seemed inevitable, from high school valedictorian to a scholarship at Georgetown, then to graduate work in international relations with a focus on European diplomacy. She spent a year in Vienna, studying policy, language, and the subtle art of negotiation. She believed in systems, in institutions, in the idea that the right words, spoken the right way, could shape history. But life doesn't care about credentials. During her final year in grad school, Emma's mother suffered a sudden cardiac arrest in a public clinic. A piece of equipment meant to monitor her vitals failed, a faulty wire, a budget cut, a missed inspection. The hospital never admitted fault. The manufacturer offered a legal statement and a quiet settlement. Emma turned it down. Her mother died, and something inside Emma fractured. She withdrew from the program, moved back to the States, drifted from city to city, job to job, fueled by quiet rage and a need to disappear. Eventually, she landed in New York and found a place like Ethelgard's, a sanctuary of silence and structure where she could serve without being seen. It was safer that way. She didn't tell people she had nearly earned a master's. She didn't mention Vienna. She just folded linen napkins and remembered how to listen in 5 languages. To the guests, she was just Emma, the server. Pleasant, efficient, unremarkable. But inside, she was still sharp, still judgmental. And sometimes, when a certain type of customer walked in, the loud ones, the wealthy ones, the men who thought success bought manners, that buried fire rose up. She thought she knew who they were. And that night, when Malik Carter took his seat, she thought she had him figured out too. She had no idea. It started like any other evening. The dining room at Ethelgard's buzzed with its usual low hum, soft jazz in the background, the faint clink of cutlery, whispered conversations wrapped in candlelight. Emma Clark had already been on her feet for 4 hours, weaving in and out of tables like clockwork, her face set in that polite, unreadable expression perfected through repetition. Then he walked in. Malik Carter wasn't the first black man to dine at Ethelgard's, but something about him, the quiet confidence, the way he didn't wait for the maitre d' to guide him, made heads turn. He wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored but not flashy, no tie, open collar. His presence didn't shout. It simply filled the space. Emma watched from the corner of her eye as he took a table near the window. It was a prime seat, usually held for regulars or names the manager didn't need to Google. He didn't seem surprised to be seated there. He simply nodded and opened the menu. She didn't recognize him, and in Ethelgard's, that was rare. Most high-rolling clients had been there before. They were hedge fund types, celebrities, or executives with reputations that walked in ahead of them. But this man, no one on staff whispered his name. No one rushed over to schmooze. Just a reservation under M. Carter. Emma approached his table, not with disdain, but with curiosity dipped in quiet skepticism. She had served enough men with money and attitude to build her own radar, and something about him triggered it. Too calm. Too comfortable. And that watch, minimalist but worth more than her rent. He looked up as she arrived, smiled with genuine warmth, and said, "Good evening." Emma returned the smile. "Welcome to Ethelgard's. Still or sparkling water?" "Still, please." "No ice." She nodded, turned away, and returned moments later with the water. As she poured it, her co-worker Alex passed by, muttering under his breath, "That guy looks like he owns the place." Emma smirked and, without thinking, replied in fluent German, "He probably thinks he does." Another startup prince who thinks Berlin makes him a global citizen. It wasn't meant to be cruel, more reflex than malice. She thought he wouldn't understand. He hadn't given any reason to suspect otherwise. But Malik heard every word. He didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He simply sipped his water, met her eyes, and waited. Because sometimes silence is not ignorance. It is calculation. And Malik Carter was just getting started. The silence that followed her comment hung heavy in the air. Emma didn't notice it at first. She was already halfway through turning toward the next table when she felt something. A pause, too long to be casual, Too precise to be accidental. She glanced back. Malik Carter was looking directly at her. Not with anger. Not with shock. With focus. He placed his glass gently back on the table and folded his hands. Then he spoke. In flawless, crisp German. Wenn man jemanden beleidigen will, sollt man zumindest die Grammatik beherrschen. If you're going to insult someone, you should at least get the grammar right. Emma froze. For a second, her mind refused to process what just happened. The words echoed in her ears like an alarm that refused to shut off. She turned fully, her face betraying just the hint of confusion, the faintest crack in her polished exterior. Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't smirk. His tone was calm, dangerously calm. The kind of calm that doesn't aim to humiliate, but to educate. Still in German, he continued, it's a common mistake, but when using the accusative case with prepositions of motion, you conjugate differently. I'm sure you know that. Or at least, you used to. There was no sarcasm. Just facts, delivered with the same quiet control he brought into every boardroom. Emma's mouth went dry. For the first time since she started working at Ethelgard's, she didn't know what to say. Her eyes searched his, looking for, what, exactly? Mercy. Retaliation. She found neither. Just clarity. Malik leaned back slightly and switched to English. Berlin is beautiful this time of year. Though I always preferred the calm of Heidelberg. It was subtle. Devastating. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't gloating. He was simply responding. Matching the moment. And in doing so, flipping the entire dynamic without ever leaving his seat. Emma managed a weak smile, but her cheeks burned. The room hadn't noticed. No gasps. No dropped forks. But to her, the exchange felt deafening. She had misjudged him. She had assumed. And in just 3 sentences, Malik Carter had reminded her, and anyone who bothered to look beneath the surface, that dignity doesn't need a stage. Sometimes, it just needs a pause, and the right language. Emma turned on her heel and disappeared into the kitchen. She needed air. Or maybe she needed time. Either way, her mind was spinning, her cheeks flushed, and her heart pounded with something she couldn't quite name. Embarrassment? Shame? Or was it something deeper, the bitter sting of being caught in a lie you told yourself? For the past year, she had told herself she didn't care who these people were. That the suits and the power and the polished manners were just masks. That behind them, they were all the same, entitled, disconnected, cold. And yet, there he was. Calm, eloquent, unshaken. Not just fluent in German, but refined. Precise. A man of depth. A man of culture. A man who had not only heard her insult, but corrected her with grace. She didn't know what stung more, the fact that he understood her, or the fact that he hadn't chosen to humiliate her in return. Back on the dining floor, she moved like muscle memory, delivering appetizers, refilling glasses, checking orders. But her rhythm was off. Her timing slipped. She could feel his presence like gravity. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just constant. At one point, their eyes met again. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her like someone who saw more than what she tried to show. And that made it worse. Later in the evening, unable to help herself, she approached his table again under the guise of checking on his meal. The words tumbled out before she could filter them. "Sir," she said, keeping her voice low, "I'd like to apologize for earlier. That wasn't professional." Malik looked up, setting down his fork. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently. "But I appreciate it." His kindness didn't soften the blow. If anything, it made her feel smaller. Because he had every right to lash out, and he chose not to. As she turned to walk away, Malik added one final sentence. "In case no one's told you lately, you speak German beautifully. But judgment, that's a language we should all be careful using." Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Because sometimes, the most painful lessons aren't shouted. They're whispered, right when you need to hear them most. That night, after her shift ended, Emma didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked. No destination, no plan. Just movement. Letting the cool night air bite at her skin, hoping it would do something to quiet the storm building in her chest. The streets of New York blurred past her in a haze of headlights and distant horns, but her mind wasn't there. It was back in Oregon, in a fluorescent-lit hospital hallway, holding a cup of vending machine coffee that had long gone cold. Her mother, Margaret Clark, had been her whole world. A brilliant woman with a sharp mind and a soft laugh, she taught Emma more than language. She taught her how to think, how to listen, how to question everything, even authority. Especially authority. Margaret wasn't wealthy, but she believed in preparation. She took care of her health. She had her yearly checkups, ate clean, stayed active. So when she collapsed in their kitchen one Sunday afternoon, it didn't make sense. The ambulance took 7 minutes. The ER was crowded. The equipment that was supposed to monitor her vitals had a known software defect, something the hospital administrator would later refer to as a documented but unresolved concern. The monitor failed mid-treatment. A critical reading was missed. By the time they caught it, it was too late. Margaret died at 57 from something that should have been manageable, treatable. The company that produced the equipment issued a statement. The hospital offered a settlement. Emma declined both. She didn't want their money. She wanted someone to say it mattered. That her mother wasn't just a line item in a quarterly report. But no one did. That was the moment Emma lost faith. Not just in the healthcare system, but in people who claimed to care, only to protect their bottom line when things went wrong. She never forgot the name of the company behind the failure. Gentech Instruments. What she didn't know, not yet, was that Gentech had since been absorbed, rebranded, its broken devices phased out and replaced. And the company responsible for that overhaul? The one that brought in newer, safer systems? Nimble Labs. Malik Carter's company. The man she had misjudged wasn't part of the system that failed her. He was part of what fixed it. But that truth was still a few steps away. For now, all Emma felt was guilt, and a growing awareness that the man she had mocked might hold more of her mother's legacy than anyone else ever had. Emma didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop, the screen dim, a blank document open. 4 hours, she typed nothing. Her fingers hovered, paused, withdrew. Then finally, around 3 in the morning, she began to write. It wasn't long. Barely a dozen sentences. But it was honest. She wrote about her behavior, her assumptions, her misjudgment. She didn't justify it. She didn't try to soften it. She simply owned it. And at the end, she wrote 4 words that had taken her all night to reach. I'm sorry, I assumed. She didn't expect a reply. In fact, she didn't even sign it with her full name. Just Emma, and a short line, if you ever want to talk, I'm listening. She left it with the maitre d' the next evening, sealed in a plain envelope, addressed to Mr. Carter. No frills. No expectations. 2 days passed. Then, on a crisp Thursday afternoon, she found a note tucked into her locker. Just one line, handwritten in tight, steady script. Daily grind. 10 a.m. Saturday. No pressure, just conversation. M. She read it 3 times, her heart pounding louder with each one. When Saturday came, she arrived early. Too early. She sat in the corner of the coffee shop, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea she didn't even like, her nerves tangled like wires. She didn't know what she would say, or what he would say. At 9:59, the door opened. Malik walked in, same quiet confidence, dressed in jeans and a jacket that looked worn, not expensive. No suit. No watch. Just him. He spotted her instantly, gave a small nod, and approached. Emma, he said simply. Malik, she replied, standing briefly before sitting again. For a moment, they said nothing. Just the sound of steam hissing from the espresso machine, and the low murmur of early weekend customers. I wasn't sure you'd come, she finally said. I wasn't sure you'd write, he answered. They both smiled, just a little. Then Emma took a breath. What I said that night, it came from a place I don't like admitting exists. Malik nodded. We all carry places like that. The question is what we do with them once they show. She looked up at him. I want to do better. He didn't hesitate. Then start here. And they did, not with apologies or speeches, but with honesty. A rare, quiet kind of honesty that doesn't erase mistakes, but gives them room to matter. What began as an apology turned into something much deeper. The conversation at the coffee shop stretched longer than either of them expected. What was meant to be 5 minutes became 30, then an hour. No small talk. No pretending. Just two people unraveling the assumptions that had kept them on opposite sides of a moment. Malik didn't talk much about himself. But when he did, his words were measured, thoughtful. He spoke about his mother. About the weight of being seen as a symbol instead of a man. About how every room he walked into, he had to prove, not just that he belonged, but that he deserved to lead. Emma listened. And for the first time, she heard more than just the voice. She heard the cost. I grew up learning how to stay 2 steps ahead, Malik said. Because if I didn't, someone else would rewrite the story of who I was. Emma looked down at her hands. I think I did that. I wrote you off in my head before I even said hello. Malik gave a soft laugh. You're not the first. And you won't be the last. But what matters is what you choose to see now. She looked at him, eyes clear. I see someone who builds. Not just companies, but people. That's rare. He paused. There was something in her tone, not admiration, but recognition. Like someone seeing clearly after a long time in the dark. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Why didn't you put me in my place that night? You could have embarrassed me. You didn't. Malik leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. Because power isn't loud, he said. It's knowing when to speak, and when to listen. You were already hearing yourself. I didn't need to raise my voice. Emma smiled, not out of politeness, but from somewhere honest. It was the beginning of something unexpected. Not friendship, not yet. But mutual understanding. Respect built not on titles or accomplishments, but on truth. When they stood to leave, Malik held the door open for her. She stepped outside into the bright morning, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. And that, more than any argument, more than any revenge, was what she hadn't realized she needed all along. Something shifted in Emma after that morning. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't wake up the next day with all the answers or a grand plan. But something inside her, something heavy and rigid, had cracked open. And in that quiet space, new thoughts began to form. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel curious again. Curious about where her pain had been hiding. Curious about what might happen if she let go of the bitterness she had clung to like armor. She had spent so long assuming the world was only made of villains and victims. But what if there were builders? What if there were people like Malik, quiet warriors, working behind the scenes to fix what others had broken? Emma started reading again. Not just fiction but research. Articles about healthcare reform, ethical technology, and policy shifts in underserved communities. She found herself going down long rabbit holes late into the night, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to understand. She wanted to know how change really happened. And slowly, an old version of herself, the version she had buried years ago, began to stir. 1 week later, she walked into the administrative office of a local community college. She asked about certification programs in health administration and community outreach. By the end of the month, she was enrolled in night classes. She didn't tell many people. Not because she was ashamed, but because this choice was hers alone. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about undoing her past. It was about building something from it. At work, she noticed her posture had changed. She no longer looked away when a guest entered the room. She no longer shrank when someone made an assumption. She carried herself with quiet dignity, not because she had something to hide, but because she had nothing left to fear. One evening, during a slower shift, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror by the bar. And for the first time in a long time, she saw someone she didn't want to run from. She saw someone becoming. Not perfect. Not complete. But growing. And in that simple reflection, Emma realized something important. Redemption doesn't always come in the form of forgiveness from others. Sometimes, it's the permission you give yourself to start again. 1 year later, Emma's world looked entirely different. She no longer wore an apron or carried a tray. She no longer moved through rooms trying not to be seen. Instead, she walked into the offices of Nimble Labs each morning with purpose, a lanyard around her neck, a laptop under her arm, and a quiet fire in her eyes. She had started as a part-time consultant, helping the outreach team build bridges with underserved communities. But it didn't take long for her to stand out. Her background in diplomacy, her language skills, and most of all, her lived experience. It made her more than a resume. It made her essential. Now, she was the director of community partnerships. Her job wasn't just about planning events or writing grants. It was about listening. About sitting with families in neighborhoods often ignored, asking what they needed, and making sure nimble labs delivered. She traveled. She sat in community centers and church basements. She helped translate complex medical terms into words people could trust. And through it all, she worked closely with Malik. Their connection had deepened over time, not in the way most people would assume, but in a quiet, steady rhythm built on shared values. They respected each other, challenged each other, and sometimes, over coffee between meetings, they still talked about that night at Evelgard's. How one misstep had opened the door to something neither of them had planned for. Emma had even shared her mother's story with the team. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. And when she told it, not one person looked at her with pity. They looked at her with resolve. Her story became part of the company's mission, a reminder that behind every policy, every product, every innovation, there were real lives on the line. And in a quiet conference room overlooking the skyline, Emma placed a framed photo of her mother on a shelf beside the company's first prototype. No speech. No announcement. Just a private moment of remembrance. A full circle. What began as a confrontation had become a collaboration. Not just between Emma and Malik, but between pain and progress, past and future. Together, they were building something bigger than either of them. Not just a company. A movement. And it all started with one conversation. Spoken in the right language, at the right time, by two people brave enough to keep listening. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is pause. In a world that moves fast, where judgments are made in seconds and people are reduced to headlines, titles, uniforms, or the way they dress, it's easy to forget that every person carries a story. A history. A weight we cannot see. Emma made a mistake, one rooted in hurt, in bias, in grief she had never faced. But instead of denying it, she owned it. She reached out. And in doing so, she opened a door to something real. Malik had every reason to shut her down, to prove a point. But he didn't. Because he knew the difference between reacting and responding. He chose grace. And that choice created space. For growth, for redemption, for a new beginning. That's the lesson. Grace matters. Assumptions hurt. But forgiveness heals. When we take the time to listen, really listen, we stop seeing people as stereotypes and start seeing them as human, flawed, complicated, capable of change. You don't have to be perfect to start over. You just have to be willing. Willing to own your part. Willing to learn. Willing to build better, one small act at a time. Emma and Malik didn't just rewrite their own stories. They challenged the system around them. And they reminded us that change doesn't always happen through loud protests or grand gestures. Sometimes, it begins in the quiet corners, at a dinner table, over a cup of coffee, or in a conversation you didn't expect to have. So the next time you catch yourself making a snap judgment, pause. Ask a better question. Look a little deeper. Because who someone is, and who they've had to become, might just surprise you. And if this story moved you even a little, do us a favor. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity, grace, and growth are always possible. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the quiet strength in all of us. Thanks for listening. And remember, what you say matters. But how you choose to hear someone else, that can change everything.